All right, at this time, I'm going to bring up a speaker who a lot of you in this room know. He has worked with us over the years in many different type of regulatory battles throughout this country. Scott Strauss is no stranger to the utility workers, and he's a partner at Spiegel and McDermott, a Washington, D.C. law firm that represents local and state government and consumers on energy, telecommunications, environmental, and transportation matters. Scott has served for more than a decade as counsel to the utility workers and its locals and proceedings before state and federal utility commissions involving utility rates, mergers and acquisitions, and industry restructuring. Scott is a 1981 cum laude graduate of the University of Pennsylvania Law School, where he was a law review editor. Scott received his undergrad degree from Cornell University School of Industrial Labor Relations and has been selected time and again for inclusion in the Washington, D.C. Super Lawyers Magazine in energy practice area. Scott, let's all welcome Scott Strauss.
Don't you forget about me. Don't you forget about me. Will you stand above?
How y'all doing? Good afternoon. I bring you greetings from Washington, D.C., the nation's capital and the only city in America where the lawyers outnumber the human beings. Work with me, people. I'm not a labor lawyer. That's a joke from a lawyer. Come on. I'm not a labor lawyer. I'm a utilities lawyer. My job is to help advance your interests by participating in utility commission proceedings across the country. And with all that's been going on in the industry, I have been active and you have been active. And Mike asked me to come in this morning and speak to you about some of the matters on which I've been involved on your behalf and spend a couple of minutes talking about what I see coming down the pike for the Utility Workers Union. Now, at the convention, you're adopting a resolution that identifies participation in regulatory proceedings as a key function for your union. Let me start by explaining why that is so important. The first reason is that you have essential interests at stake in these proceedings. State utility commissions have the legal authority to address infrastructure issues, both physical and human, and those are near and dear to each of you. The need to strengthen and rebuild America's infrastructure. The focus of this conference is obvious. In the past few years, a hurricane shut down New York City and left people in the dark, millions of people, for days. In San Bruno, California, and in New York City, gas line explosions demolished buildings and killed citizens. And a chemical leak overwhelmed the water supply of Charleston, West Virginia. And as climate change impacts weather patterns, the need to pay close attention to utility infrastructure. And that includes ensuring that companies have a sufficient number of skilled utility workers is only going to become more important. Now, the second reason it's important for you to be in these proceedings, you have a unique position to advocate. You're out in the field every day, you know things about your utility system that no one, maybe even your employer, knows. You can speak with authority because you speak from firsthand, on-the-ground experience. Facts are hard to refute, they're even harder to ignore. And the third reason is, if you don't protect your interests in these proceedings, do not count on anyone else doing so. Ratepayer advocates and attorney generals might provide support, and we should certainly reach out to them. But in the end, they may be unsympathetic to addressing staffing deficiencies because it costs ratepayers money to do so, even if that money is well spent. So that's why you need to be here. Let me give you a few examples of what we've been able to accomplish by participating in these proceedings over the last 4 years. Let me start in West Virginia. In mid-2011, the UWUA filed a complaint with the West Virginia Public Service Commission asking that it enjoin a layoff of 1/10 of the employee workforce of West Virginia American Water Company. That's right, we fought a layoff before a Public Service Commission. Here's how we did it. We relied on the testimony of local members and the company's own statements and demonstrated that the company would be unable to provide adequate service if the employees were laid off. The commission held a hearing, found that the UWUA represented employees were performing essential services, and ruled that the company could not move ahead with plans to eliminate their positions. We believe that this is the only time that a state utility commission has issued a permanent injunction halting a layoff. But it was built on a very simple idea. If you don't have enough skilled and experienced utility workers, you cannot run a utility properly. Now let me move north to New York, where we've been involved in a number of proceedings. First, in July 2012, Con Edison, the utility that serves millions in New York City and surrounding communities, locked out the roughly 8,000 members of UWUA Local 1-2 and sought to continue running their operations through a combination of managers, retirees, and contractors. That lockout lasted 27 days. One of the ways in which your union responded was by filing a petition with the New York Public Service Commission, asking that it investigate whether Con Ed could provide safe and reliable service without its union-represented workforce. The petition noted the assessment of a Con Ed manager concerning how the system would function without the union personnel. He said, quote, "As long as nothing major happens, we can maintain the system," close quote. Imagine, talk about cold comfort, that's in New York City. Now, while the PSC did not rule on the substance of the union's petition, its submission generated substantial attention on the dispute and helped to convince New York Governor Cuomo to insert himself into the negotiations directly. And shortly thereafter, the dispute was resolved. Now, 4 months later, in October 2012, Superstorm Sandy devastated New York City, leaving part of it underwater and millions in the dark. In the wake of the storm, Governor Cuomo established a panel known as the Moreland Commission and tasked it with evaluating the performance of New York's utilities in restoring service after the storm. Now, your union did not wait for the outcome of that effort. Instead, the UWUA performed their own assessment of Con Ed's performance and published their findings in a white paper and presented that white paper to the Moreland Commission. The white paper explained that Con Ed had not been ready for the storm because it was understaffed, because its system had not been properly maintained, and because deficiencies caused by the month-long lockout had not been properly fixed. Instead of conducting maintenance on a proactive basis, Con Ed has a simple rule for how they run their distribution system: run it till it fails. That's the new policy. The union asked that Con Ed be directed to propose a baseline staffing level and that it be obligated to staff its operations at that level. Now, the following June, the Moreland Commission report was issued. It recited the union's concerns, and it recommended that the state's utilities, quote, "review existing staffing levels and evaluate the impacts of an aging workforce," close quote. Now, while all of this was going on, Con Edison filed for approval of a substantial rate increase, and we're talking about something on the order of $400 million. The UWUA participated in the case. We testified about staffing deficiencies, about a lack of adequate maintenance, about heavy reliance on contractors instead of in-house personnel. The union's participation in this case led to several positive developments, the most significant of which was the PSC's announcement of its intention to conduct an independent audit of the staffing practices of all of New York's investor-owned utilities, including policies for the use of outside contractors. That audit report will be issued next month. The decision to do this audit is directly responsible to your Superstorm Sandy white paper, which focused on staffing. It's responsive to the Moreland Commission report, which recommended an audit. And it's responsive to the union's rate case testimony, which focused on staffing issues. This is potentially a very big deal. It's another first. It's the first time a state commission has ordered an audit focused entirely on utility staffing practices and the use of in-house versus contractor employees. And because this is happening in New York, undoubtedly this report is going to receive a substantial amount of attention. All right, let me move briefly from the East Coast to the Midwest, specifically to Michigan. In 2013, the Michigan PSC undertook an investigation to explore Michigan's energy future. The UWUA responded by conducting a membership survey and presenting the results. 3 main findings, and they're going to sound awfully familiar. 1, Michigan's utilities are understaffed. 2, the understaffing has adverse impacts on service delivery, on Michigan's economy, and on the quality of lives of both customers and workers. And 3, Michigan's utility workforce is aging rapidly, but utility employers are not doing enough to ensure that there will continue to be a sufficient supply of well-trained utility workers to meet the needs. Now, following the presentations of these findings, just before Christmas in 2013, Michigan experienced a very severe ice storm. An estimated 600,000 consumers energy and DTE electric customers were without power, some for days, right smack in the middle of the Christmas holidays. The PSC responded by opening an investigation in early January, and as in the case of Superstorm Sandy, the UWUA responded by surveying its members and its affected locals, conducting its own assessment, and filing comments with the Commission. The findings were familiar. We highlighted staffing deficiencies, noting that they adversely impact both the conditions of the consumer system as well as the efficiency and timeliness of restoration efforts. One fact that's kind of interesting that came out of this, only 14% of the line crews and none of the forestry crews involved in restoring service were in the direct employ of consumers. The restoration efforts were conducted almost entirely by a combination of contract labor and mutual aid workers, and we expressed concern about that. Now, in May 2014, the Commission issued an order responding to our concerns and urged the utilities and the UWUA to jointly consider the union's recommendation for an independent audit regarding the adequacy of baseline staffing levels. This is much along the lines of what has already been ordered in New York. All right, with these efforts as a backdrop, let me just pause for a few minutes and talk a bit about the future. One thing seems crystal clear. Utility infrastructure issues are only going to become more important. We're experiencing increasingly frequent events of severe weather. More bad weather means more outages, and more focus on deteriorating utility infrastructure, and more focus on the need for systems to be made more resilient. For the UWUA, one key message is to ensure that any debate over utility infrastructure needs include human infrastructure. One message you can send to regulators is that system resiliency is more than wires and poles, it's more than rights of way and conduit. Resiliency depends on having enough skilled, well-trained, and experienced utility workers who have firsthand and long-standing knowledge of the system. That's all of you people. And this message can be linked with broader concerns. Economic growth depends on a well-functioning and strong utility grid. And as resiliency begins to focus on more localized solutions, microgrids, fuel cells, storage facilities, and the like, it will be important to ensure that tomorrow's utility workers receive the training they need to keep up with tomorrow's utility infrastructure. Now, separately, another issue that has come up in the past few years, and I think will be an issue obviously going forward, is the closing of power plants, ostensibly in response to environmental mandates and the related job losses that come with those closures. Whatever the appropriateness of any given closure decision, it should never be appropriate for utilities to strand the workers and the communities that depended on those plants for employment and tax revenue. When this country made utility deregulation the wave of the future, it also made darn certain that utilities and their shareholders would not lose a dime of so-called stranded investment costs. By the same token, there is no justification to strand utility workers who have given their professional lives to these facilities only to see them close through no fault of their own. This issue should be raised with regulators and with political leaders. Let me leave you with one concluding thought. One point I hope comes across loud and clear. Regardless of where you live and where you work, the core issues that the UWUA and its locals are raising before state regulatory commissions are very much the same. Understaffing, over-reliance on contractors rather than building a long-term professional workforce, inadequate maintenance, deteriorating infrastructure, few efforts to fill the pipeline with younger people. They are everywhere you look and in every aspect of the utility industries in which you work. That means you have issues you can build around nationally because you're facing problems that are national in scope. And remember, your success and the country's success are tied together. Thanks for letting me speak today, and thank you for letting me be a part of something so meaningful.